Good morning. Welcome to our third week in our Lenten devotional series. The wilderness is a theme we see throughout the scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament alike, from Abraham to Moses to Jesus and the apostles. The wilderness is something you can't escape when reading the Bible. Now, there's tons that can be said about it, but what has particularly stood out to me recently is how we, most Christians, have viewed the wilderness. Most assume it's this gnarly, tough place, one that all Christians must experience at one point or another, maybe even a rite of passage, but one you don't necessarily want to take. It's often viewed as the place where we suffer or hold on to with white knuckles, or even a place where we just endure the absence of God's presence. While it certainly can be and feel like all of those things, I've been wondering what the desert was really what it was intended to be. In the Exodus story, for example, we see evidence of hardship and heartache as they wandered 40 years in the wilderness. But in their story, is there more than meets the eye? And if there is, how is it supposed to inform how we live today? In Matthew 3, we read about the time when Jesus was led into the wilderness. It's chapter 3, verse 13. You can follow along right here. It says, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, 'I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?' Jesus replied, 'Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness.' Then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water, and at that moment heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" Next word. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you're the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." And Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." And then the rest of the story you may be familiar with, or you can read on your own. But what stands out here is that immediately following his baptism and this affirmation by the Father, Jesus heads directly for the wilderness upon the Spirit's prompting. Now, that word wilderness in the Greek is eremos, which has a variety of meanings depending on the context. It can be translated as wilderness or the desert, but can also be translated as the lonely place. The lonely place. Now, there's tons that we could unpack there, even in a text this short. But what drew me in recently is that interesting line, Jesus was led by the Spirit. Honestly, when I read that recently, it was like I was seeing it for the first time. It made me wonder and ask, why would the Spirit lead Jesus into the wilderness, to that dark and desolate place? I mean, sure, to confront Satan and temptation as the story goes, but why the wilderness? And many of us read this as Matthew's way of creating a vulnerable scene for Jesus. We read it as though Satan arrives when Jesus is weak, 40 days alone, nothing to eat. Watch how strong Jesus is going to be. He's God after all. And I don't know about you, but I would be far from my best self 40 days after my last meal. But it seems that this isn't the case with Jesus. Many scholars think that the eremos does not represent a state of weakness, but instead a place of strength. So yes, while Jesus was strong, it was because of the desert, not in spite of it. This new discovery of mine blew my mind, because as I reread the story through this lens, everything changed. In Matthew, the Spirit draws Jesus into the eremos, because when these 40 days of solitude and fasting concluded, Jesus, at his lowest in many ways, especially physically speaking, would be at the height of his spiritual prowess. Then and only then would he be properly equipped and suited to face the evil one. That's a game changer for me. I mean, there's so much to be said in this season we find ourselves in. Many of us feel like we've been going through or coming out of a wilderness season of sorts for one reason or another. But I wonder if instead of seeing it as a place of desolation, we saw it more as a place of consolation or fortification. What would change for us? I mean, back to the Israelites wandering in the desert in Exodus. What if we read their story through the lens of strengthening, not suffering? What if we read about the cloud by day and the fire by night, and instead of seeing them as lifelines, we also saw them as markers of God's presence and strength, physical pictures of God's withness? Or looking over at Paul's time in the wilderness before his ministry began, what if we read that less as a place to be purified or sorted out, and more as an act of consecration for the empowerment of his calling? What would change for you, for me, if we saw our wilderness season as a place for God wanting to strengthen you? What would you welcome differently? Would you, instead of resisting, just embrace what's in front of you with new vision, hope, and even a different perspective? All throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus, our rabbi, return to the Eremos again and again. We read that he wakes up early to go to the Eremos. He leaves his disciples and goes to the Eremos. And then he leaves the crowds and he heads for the Eremos. That means that there is something there for us. Something that reaches beyond survival and has the deep capacity to bring us strength. Someone who doesn't want to just keep us alive, but who also wants to help us thrive. See, there's a place for purification in the wilderness, but it always has purpose. Things must be stripped away, but only to lighten our load enough to keep us in step with the Spirit. Now, I don't know where this hits you today, but my prayer is that you will welcome a perspective change as it pertains to your wilderness, that you would be bold and embrace all that the wilderness has forced you to see and know, and that you would, with faith, look for the strengthening work of God in your life, knowing that you are never actually alone, even in the lonely place. God bless.